welcome to Moving Forward, a production of the Bay and Grandstown Advancement Association. This program looks at obstacles in the way of progress for our nation and our communities, and we seek with the help of well-qualified persons to address those, hopefully to reduce and, if possible, remove them. And that is what we are all about. So welcome to this 1 hour program. My name is Reverend C.B. Moss. I am your host. Today we are celebrating the Emancipation Day period. As a matter of fact, yesterday was the official celebration of the Emancipation Day in the Bahamas. That was August 7th. And today other celebrations are going on around the nation, which is very good. And so we're taking this opportunity to take an in-depth look at the whole issue of slavery, emancipation, and the way forward. And we are doing it not with just rhetoric. We're doing it professionally. We're doing it with empirical evidence derived from research by professional people. And one of those persons is here with us today to share his vast knowledge of the subject of slavery, emancipation, and the development of the Bahamian people. His name is Professor Christopher Curry. He is on the faculty of the University of the Bahamas. And let me say up front, in case I don't have an opportunity to say it late in the program, the University of the Bahamas, through its president and its whole family, have been most supportive to the efforts of the Bay and Grandstown Advancement Association, not only in getting this program going, but in almost everything. And I think they're really coming of age. And I think we are proud of the university at this stage, but I believe we're going to be even prouder as time goes on. So we encourage everybody, support the University of the Bahamas. Your children, when they're ready for university, the best university is the University of the Bahamas. Send them there. Don't worry about those universities abroad. And I know sometimes it is sort of prestigious to say, I'm going to Canada, I'm going to New Orleans, I'm going to Chicago. Let's go to the University of the Bahamas. You can't get better. And so having given them that big plug, which they rightly deserve, let me welcome you.
It's great to be here.
Curry.
Reverend C.B. Moss.
And it's a pleasure having you. I need to say that we couldn't find a better person to have with us, personally, because we go way back.
Yes, we do.
And we also have interacted with with you at the then College of the Bahamas. Sure. And I can say that through your studies with your classes, our association has benefited greatly because you've shared your research information on Bay and Town with us. And it has been very revealing and very, very helpful to our development. But that's another story for another day. We're going to talk about slavery, emancipation, the good, the bad, and the ugly,
yes,
the warts, the bumps, because let's face it, a lot of us, are not free of blame. And so let us unveil the whole story. But just before we do that, Professor, let us ask you to just give us a brief background of your training and your period at the university.
Well, let me start by saying I grew up in the Bahamas, in Nassau. I schooled early at Queen's College, left after grade 9, completed BJCs. Went to Canada and finished high school in a small little town called Beamsville in the Ontario, province of Ontario, I should say. I then matriculated into Brock University, and I started out at Brock, which is small to middle-sized college in Canada. I started out as an English major, but I switched to history in my first year after really encountering one of the most dynamic professors. Had a real impact on my development intellectually at that time as I was pursuing a BA. His name was Alan Arthur, and he taught medieval history. Actually, it wasn't really connected in any way to Bahamian history or anything, but he just taught it differently. He focused not on memorizing names, dates, places, and things, but he taught history as an analytically driven intellectually rigorous subject discipline. He taught me that the value of history was in the engaging debates that historians often have with each other. But history wasn't just about memorizing names and all of that. So I switched to history, and I finished a BA in history. And at that time, I was thinking of graduate work. And I had started reading some Bahamian history at that point, and I realized that there was a professor in Canada, in Ontario, who would be someone that I would want to study Bahamian history at the graduate level on, and that was Michael Creighton. So I actually applied to graduate work and did my master's degree under the tutelage of Michael Creighton. Michael Creighton was in fact my thesis supervisor. And Michael Creighton, some of you may know, was the first person to write what we would call a full survey of Bahamian history from pre-Columbian to majority rule. And his book, A History of the Bahamas, was first published in 1962. It went through two major editions. New editions came out in 1969, and then the last one came out in 1985. He then went and partnered with Gail Saunders to write the two best, I would say the two best and most comprehensive surveys of Bahamian history. Really, the first social history that we have of our country was Islanders in the Stream, Volume 1 and Volume 2, which him and Gail Saunders wrote. Gail Saunders studied under him as well. Gail Saunders did her PhD under Michael Creighton. I did my master's degree under him. So we both benefited from a good relationship with him. And so in many ways, he fathered both Gail and I intellectually into history and the practice and discipline. My master's thesis under Creighton looked at religion and slavery. And I was trying to test whether or not religion in the Bahamas was a conservative force in enslaved minds, leading them in a different direction from revolution. What we had learned, and again under his tutelage, was that in most of the Anglophone Caribbean territories, the injection of Christian theology by way of foreign missionaries led to revolts in Demerara, in Barbados, and definitely in Jamaica in 1831. But I surmise there was no major revolt that had as its catalyst a religious theology. There were revolts, but they had more practical,
more social,
and more social kind of origins. Pompey wasn't moved to lead his people because of a theology or religion on the ground. It was because he did not want to be moved. So it was more practical and social, as you put it. But Creighton and I had a good relationship, and that thesis was important actually to the work I've recently published. It's always stuck with me, the importance of history and religion, tying the two together. Anyways, I came back to the Bahamas. I taught for 6 years at St. Anne's in Fox Hill before moving on to the college. I've been at the college now, university, since 2002, which seems like a long time ago. And in the course of being at the college, I applied for study leave to pursue my doctorate, and I was able to go off to the University of Connecticut. In 2006, I came back home, not having completed, but moved far enough along in my studies to where I was basically completing the dissertation from home in 2010. And I defended my PhD dissertation in March of 2011 and graduated with my PhD in 2011. Since then, I've come back and I've continued to work. I've done a lot of work in the colonial period, but I've also done a lot of work on the post-independence period, looking at issues of race and national identity. But my heart is still in the colonial period. CB, you'll know that as a historian, there's only about 6 or 7 of us, a handful of us that have PhDs. And you cannot at this stage in our development be a specialist, meaning I can't sit in the colonial period my entire career and just write on the colonial period. I have to move back and forth between different areas, different periods in our history, precisely because I can't be a specialist.
That's right, because the need is too great.
Yes, there's a national need for historians to be able to speak on almost any topic.
Absolutely, and that would be reflected in our people because we are woefully ignorant of our history.
Well, that's true.
Most of us. And even the most educated, they're educated in areas largely removed from our history, which is important to tell us who we are, where we've come from, help us to determine where we're going. But no one could argue that you are eminently qualified.
Well, and I think too, because the area that I'm working in, and the work that I just published a new book that came out this spring, and it's called Freedom and Resistance.
Yes, I saw it, and you promised to.
I still have to bring you a copy.
You promised to bring me my copy, and of course to autograph it.
Yes, sir. Yes,
I'm
sir.
going to put that in my library and make sure I keep that, because I'm sure it's a great work.
And you understand just from that title that it's speaking about this period of enslavement, which it surely does. It's looking at a group that come over at the end of the American Revolution as free persons of color, having not just fought for the British, but been given certificates of freedom by British officials. But when they come to the Bahamas, they find that their freedom is now challenged. It's being contested by white loyalists who are trying to re-enslave them. So it's a story embedded in the whole narrative of enslavement, but it's also a triumphant story because a lot of these individuals become institutional founders. They become educators, they become important social activists, and they clamor for freedom in courts, and they agitate in a way that really becomes a foundation for really the development of Bahamian society since.
Well, we're going to touch on that period because I think the European residents of Nassau at that time reacted out of gross fear. They were very fearful, and we'll touch on that. But let us start by saying slavery has been with us, for mankind has been with us. Slavery is basically the imposition of power by some group, some entity that's stronger than the other. And so slavery is nothing new. Now, slavery started in the Western Hemisphere, in our part of the world, by the Portuguese. Now, we go back to a time when labor was desperately needed, which leads me to ask you, in your opinion, or from your research, was slavery exclusively about race? Was it about economics? A combination?
That's an excellent question, and I ask my students that question a lot of time, and I always frame it in the which came first, the chicken or the egg scenario. It's a causal relationship.
That's right.
So the question is, did slavery produce racism? Yes. Or did racism produce slavery?
That's right.
And I'll tell you that there's a long and rich historiography in the Caribbean on this very topic. Now, Eric Williams, the former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, and a prominent historian, and he has this great work called Capitalism and Slavery. And in it, he argues that slavery, and he's talking about the transatlantic dimension of slavery. Classical slavery existed around the world for many centuries, but there's a more heinous kind of slavery that emerges with the Portuguese and European contact with West Africa, and then the transplantment of those individuals to the Caribbean. That's a more heinous chapter in global slavery. And what he is arguing is that was fundamentally an economic enterprise, meaning that there was no racial ideology that initially
that's right.
Initially created the scenario whereby Africans were brought to the Caribbean. What he's saying is that there was, of course, a huge demand for labor because of the genocide of the indigenous people.
That's right.
And so in that space, Europeans determined that the African could be brought over and could be put into a coercive labor regiment, all right, and eventually they would then meet that demand, and that is true, but I want to amend that, okay, because I believe that there was always a latent kind of racial ideology, and what I mean by that is, if you read early accounts of the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Iberian Peninsula, they initially brought enslaved persons to Portugal and to Spain. And there were always an early period, 12th to 15th century, where they had contact with the Moors. The Moors were West Africans who were Muslim. And what we found is Europeans started to look and identify Africans as infidels. And that shift towards thinking of them as infidels meant that they were inferior, but also not Christian.
That's right.
And then they shifted from saying, well, they're not Christian, they're infidels, they're now barbaric, they don't have a soul.
That's right.
And because they don't have a soul, they went a step further and eventually advanced the case that because they don't have a soul, they're not human.
And they justified it morally.
Yes.
I mean, even in England at the time, the feeling was those Africans, those they should be delighted. They're taken out of
Right.
out of an environment.
Right, and even the language of how they expressed or
That's
felt
right.
about Africa, they talked about Africa as the dark continent, as
Yes.
if it was devoid of any kind of intellectual activity.
And a lot of that was moral justification, I think, even though some of it was ignorance. But much of it was to allow them to continue doing what they were doing. And we saw some of that in Nassau when the Lutheran Adventurers came and they brought
Yes, they did.
some Africans from Bermuda.
Yes, they did.
And some of the local people here. Anyway, we're going to take a quick break. We're off to a fantastic start. Much more to come. Stay with us.